We're in the middle of a 3-week cycle here in Matthew's Gospel about the vineyards and the workers in the vineyard. Of course, in the biblical imagery, the vineyard owner is God. And in their imagination, Israel is the vineyard. Israel is the vine that God has planted and tended and cared for. And so the workers in the vineyard then are sent by the owner, sent by God, to bring forth a harvest of righteousness and justice. God is looking for the good fruit of good behavior and right action. Well, this image is so much a part of Israel's imagination that when they are in exile in Babylon, they kept quoting this proverb in the book of the prophet Ezekiel. The parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. In other words, they're saying, it's our parents who sinned. That's why we're here in Babylon. It's their fault that we ended up here. Well, their reasoning goes something like this. Maybe you'll recognize your own children in their thinking. It's not our fault that we ended up here, so anything we do here is not our fault. Ezekiel and God disagree. No playing the victim card, says Ezekiel. Don't lay the blame on your parents. God has no grandchildren, only children obedient to God's word. Each one of us is responsible for our behavior, whether good or evil. The gospel poses the same question, but in a different way. Of the two sons, who did the father's will? One of the sons said the right thing, but he didn't walk the talk. The other son had the wrong attitude, but then he had a change of heart, and he did the right thing. So this raises the question, is it our thinking or our action that matters? A few weeks ago, I arranged an evening with Imam Ahmed Salih for some of the Clarkston High School students. They wanted to have an interfaith conversation, so the imam came. We were trying to get a rabbi, but he was unavailable. But during the course of our discussion that evening, somebody asked the question of the imam, is Islam experiencing the same loss of the younger generation like we're experiencing in Catholicism? And the imam gave a very interesting answer. He said no, because Islam is a religion of orthopraxy, not orthodoxy. What that means is that orthodoxy is the right thinking or right believing, but orthopraxy is doing the right thing. And Islam, he said, is a religion of doing things. So they pray 5 times a day. When you do Ramadan, everybody does Ramadan, Muslim as well as anybody else who lives in that land. So it's that doing that shapes us, gives us our identity, and it's that doing that helps us maintain and keep our identity. Father Michael Himes from Boston College, in a book called Doing the Truth in Love, says that it's the doing that shapes our identity, not the believing. He says, first you do the truth, and then you come to understand it. Ultimately, he says, orthopraxis always precedes orthodoxy. In fact, Michael Himes says, before our tradition was called Christianity, it was simply referred to in the Acts of the Apostles as the way. First of all, it is a way of life. One has to do the doctrine before one can understand the doctrine. One does not know and then do. He said, after all, if you had to understand the doctrine and mystery of the Eucharist correctly before you celebrated and participated in it, which one of us would ever have received our first communions? He said, long before I was taught religion lessons, I was taught to pray. And that is just as it should be. Practice precedes doctrine. In the Gospel of Luke, there is also a story about a father with 2 sons. And Jesus tells that story to the religious leaders, to the Pharisees, who were complaining that Jesus welcomes sinners and he eats with them, which is sort of the point of today's gospel as well. The tax collectors and prostitutes are entering into the kingdom of God ahead of the religious leaders. But in Luke 15, the story we call the prodigal son story, the prodigal, the younger son, takes the inheritance, goes off to a distant land where he wastes all of his property in dissolute living, and he ends up hungry. And then he remembers that there is more than enough food at his father's house. So he prepares a speech to get his old man to take him back in. But the father upstages him. When the prodigal comes back, we hear this in Luke's gospel. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him, and he kissed him. The father saw him, ran to him, put his arms around him, and kissed him. It turns out that in Luke 15, Luke is quoting a story in the book of Genesis from chapter 33. And that's the story of two other famous sons, and it's also a story about a stolen inheritance. It's the story of Jacob and Esau, and Jacob, the younger son, stole Esau's inheritance. And for years they lived apart, but finally Jacob wanted to be reconciled with his brother Esau. And when he goes to meet Esau, we find in the story, playing the part of the father, is the older brother Esau. Esau ran to meet him. He embraced him, fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. It's the same line. It's the same line from Luke, quoting this line from the book of Genesis. So what Jesus is doing is he's sort of acting out. He's sort of doing a mime, trying to show the elder brother how they should behave. He's showing them what love looks like. Do this, and you will understand what the Father is doing. Do this, and then you will know who God is. In the prodigal son story, the father throws a great feast for the younger son. For after all, it is a complaint that Jesus welcomes sinners and he eats with them. But in Luke's gospel, there are many stories about meals. And the most famous meal story, of course, is the story of the Last Supper. Again, Father Michael Himes invites us to think about this. He said, we frequently talk about the Eucharist as the real presence. In the Eucharist, we find Jesus of Nazareth. And in Jesus, we find God incarnate. But consider the Eucharist. It is something that is eaten so that people have life. Something that is drunk so that people are refreshed. What a profound symbolic act, revealing the great Christian insight. If you seek to know who God is, look at Jesus of Nazareth. If you seek to know who Jesus is, he is the one who is eaten so that we may be nourished. The Eucharist is the great acting out, the great doing of who Jesus and God is, the one who gives himself away fully and without reserve. So if you wish to find God, give yourself away. When we do Eucharist, we enact what we mean by the word God. In John's Gospel, immediately after Jesus washes his disciples' feet at the Last Supper, he says to them, I give you a new commandment. You must love one another as I have loved you. What's amazing here is that Jesus forgot to mention God. He didn't tell them to love God. He told them to love one another with the same love that loves us. What he's saying is that when you serve your brother or sister, you are enacting the meaning of the word God. One could say that God is closer to being a verb than a noun. God is what is done, not the one who does it, and not the one to whom it is done. God is the doing, the loving. Friday night I went to the Lake Orion homecoming game. I didn't stay to the bitter end. It was sad. But it was a big, it was homecoming, so it was a lot of people there, stands were packed. So I'm walking up the steps and, hoping that some friendly face will welcome me in. So the first friendly, oh, hi. I said, oh, is there a seat there? And I went and sat down next to a man I kind of recognized, but I didn't know his name. Well, it turns out I was sitting around all people who knew who I was, but I didn't know them. Well, at halftime, we got into a rather interesting discussion. The woman behind me introduced herself, and after a little conversation, she wanted to know what I thought of the new pope. And she was obviously quite excited about him. So I told about my hope for the upcoming Synod on the Family next weekend, and how I'm hoping that the Church will change its practice about divorced and remarried being able to come back to the Eucharist. Well, the man who was sitting next to me suddenly felt compelled to tell me his story. He said, I grew up, I was an altar boy in my parish church. He was from Troy. And he said the family was friends with the pastor there, and they often would have him to their home for dinner. So he grew up very Catholic, went to church every Sunday. And in fact, the pastor married he and his wife. And they were from our parish. That's why I recognized him. But 7 years ago, he got divorced. So he said one day he was driving to his old church in Troy, and suddenly he decided that he didn't feel all that welcome there. And he drove on down instead to Kensington in Troy. And for the last 7 years, he's been going there every Sunday for church. And I tried to explain to him that just being divorced doesn't separate you from the church, but it felt like that to him. It just felt like he was not welcomed. And so for these last 7 years, he's been going someplace else. He didn't feel welcome in our community, in our tradition. A couple of weeks ago, I was telling you the story about Cardinal Casper, who wrote a book and is arguing that we need to have mercy and a sense of compassion, that we need to practice differently in welcoming the divorced and remarried back to communion. Well, the Synod, of course, starts next week, and now this week, 5 cardinals have published a book ahead of the Synod. They are arguing against Cardinal Casper. They're arguing that we should not change our practice, that our practice is just fine. And one of them, Cardinal Burke, insists that we can't change our practice because that would change our teaching about marriage, and he said, and the church teaching cannot change. Well, he might be a cardinal, but he doesn't know the church teaching not only can change, but it does change. The Second Vatican Council, for example, the teaching about the sacramentality of marriage did change. The church teaching before that time, and it was also Humanae Vitae after the council that reiterated this new understanding as well. The church teaching used to teach that the natural good or end of marriage was procreation, to have children. But then the council taught, but you already knew this, that the end of marriage was mutuality and love between spouses. Well, we did change that teaching. And it might also be true that if we change our practice, perhaps we'll come to understand something deeper about what we believe about the sacrament of marriage. We would never say this, but in practice, it almost seems as if divorce is the only unforgivable sin. Now, this past June, I buried a man, Lou Harmon. Lou was 87. And 15 years ago, I presided at his wedding with his wife, Jeannie. It was Lou's third marriage. But they were married 15 years. He was 72 when he got married to Jeannie. But in early June, he had a stroke, and I guess he also had some dementia. I wasn't aware of that. But Lou and Jeannie were always coming to Mass. They usually came to Saturday Mass. And they used to sit more in the back, kind of like the Parentes here. But then, after a while, in the last couple of years, they started moving closer. Well, it was because it was harder for Lou to walk to communion. But I was teasing him. I said, "Oh, Lou, I think you're getting more spiritual in your old age. You're moving closer to the altar." So I went to see Lou in the hospital, and I walked in and he said hi, and so I engaged him in some conversation, but he wasn't able to speak. The hi was just, he got that out, but that was all he could say. He couldn't really communicate very well at all. And so I said, we want to pray with you and anoint you, and so he was attentive. He made the sign of the cross, and he listened to the prayers, and then it came time for the Our Father. And by now I realized he really couldn't speak, so I just said, well, Lou, Jeannie and I will pray the Our Father, and you just pray along in your heart. And so we started the Our Father, and Lou spoke every word of the Our Father. He didn't miss a word at all. It was in a different part of his brain. The part of his brain that was no longer able to speak at the moment was giving way to an older part. He had practiced that prayer all of his life. He'd said that prayer with us Sunday after Sunday. He probably learned that prayer from his mother or his grandmother, and he'd been praying that prayer ever since. It was the doing. It was the practice that carried him through all these years and brought him through right up to the end.